Laura Bennett had made a solemn vow to herself. No more dating until the new year. "I'm not looking for love," she told her best friend Melissa, for what felt like the 100th time, as they huddled in a corner of Beacon Hill Books, the scent of paper and cinnamon-spiced coffee enveloping them. "I mean it this time." Melissa rolled her eyes dramatically. "You say that after every breakup. Remember Jason from accounting?" "That was different," Laura protested, adjusting her tortoiseshell glasses. "And before that, there was the yoga instructor. He couldn't talk about anything but his chakras. And now you're swearing off men because of one bad date with—" "One bad date?" Laura's voice rose, causing a nearby customer to glance over. She lowered her tone. "Trevor showed up 30 minutes late, spent the entire dinner talking about his cryptocurrency investments, and then had the audacity to suggest we split the check after he ordered the most expensive steak on the menu." Melissa grinned. "Okay, that was admittedly awful, but that's exactly why you need to get back out there. Cleanse your palate." Laura shook her head firmly, her chestnut hair swaying around her shoulders. At 34, she'd built a successful career as a children's book editor, had a cozy apartment in the South End that she shared with her Maine Coon cat Winston and a close circle of friends. The only thing missing was a partner, but she'd convinced herself she was fine without one. "I'm happy focusing on the winter's book release. December is my busiest month anyway." Laura checked her watch. "Speaking of which, I've got to head back to the office." "Just promise me one thing," Melissa said, falling into step beside her as they exited the bookstore into Boston's brisk December air. "Be open to the possibility. That's all I'm asking." Laura zipped her burgundy wool coat tighter against the cold. "Fine. I'll be open to the possibility. In January." Melissa's grin turned sly. "Great, because I may have already set something up." Laura stopped abruptly on the sidewalk. "You didn't." "My colleague's friend just moved back to Boston after years abroad. He's handsome, smart, and best of all, hasn't been tainted by the Boston dating pool yet." "Melissa, I literally just said, it's just dinner. This Friday, at that new place in Fenway, 12 tables, very public, very casual." Melissa clasped her hands in a pleading gesture. "Please. He's supposedly an amazing guy, former humanitarian aid worker or something noble like that." Laura sighed, her breath forming a cloud in the cold air. She knew Melissa wouldn't give up easily. "Fine, one dinner. But when it inevitably goes nowhere, you have to promise not to set me up again until after New Year's." "Deal!" Melissa beamed triumphantly. "Oh, and he's going by Mike now, but I think his full name is Michael." Laura nodded absently, already regretting her decision. "Text me the details. I need to get back to work." As she hurried down the crowded street toward the tea station, Laura had no idea that she had just agreed to have dinner with the man she had once vowed to love until death did them part. Michael Hayes adjusted his tie nervously as he waited for the hostess to return. 12 Tables was bustling with Friday night energy, and a tastefully decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner, adorned with twinkling lights that reflected in the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. "Sir, your table is ready," the hostess announced. "Your dining companion hasn't arrived yet, but I can show you to your seats." "Thank you." Michael followed her through the maze of tables, conscious of his slight limp, a souvenir from the accident that had changed his life 5 years ago. The accident that had taken his memories. He'd spent years piecing his life back together after waking up in a hospital in Syria with no recollection of who he was beyond his name. His colleagues at Doctors Without Borders had helped him recover physically, but his past remained a stubborn puzzle with too many missing pieces. What he knew came from official records and the few possessions found with him. Born in Chicago, graduated from Boston University Medical School, divorced, though he had no memory of a wife, and had been working overseas for several years before the building collapse that had nearly killed him. After years of rehabilitation and continuing his humanitarian work, he'd finally decided to return to Boston, a city that should have felt like home, but instead felt like a foreign land with occasional flashes of déjà vu. The hostess seated him at a quiet corner table. "Can I get you a drink while you wait, sir?" "Just water for now, thank you," Michael replied, checking his watch. His blind date was due any minute, a setup arranged by his new colleague's wife. He wasn't particularly interested in dating, but James had been insistent, claiming that his wife's friend was just his type. Michael had nearly refused, but his therapist had encouraged him to create new connections in Boston rather than obsessing over recovering his lost past. "Sometimes moving forward is the best way to heal," she'd said during their last session. The restaurant's sound system switched to a new song, an old Christmas standard that Michael vaguely recognized. Bing Crosby's rich voice, singing White Christmas, washed over him, stirring something deep and undefined. He was so caught up in the strange feeling that he almost missed the woman approaching his table. She was attractive, with warm brown eyes behind stylish glasses and shoulder-length chestnut hair. She wore a simple black dress with a delicate silver necklace. "Are you Mike?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of professional politeness. Michael stood quickly, extending his hand. "Yes, Michael Hayes. You must be Laura." As their hands touched, a curious expression crossed her face, confusion, followed by something else he couldn't identify. She withdrew her hand quickly. "Laura Bennett," she confirmed, taking the seat across from him. "I'll be honest, I wasn't keen on a blind date, but Melissa can be very persistent." Michael smiled. "James is the same way. I just moved back to Boston after working overseas for several years, and apparently that makes me in desperate need of social connections." "What brought you back?" Laura asked, unfolding her napkin and placing it on her lap with practiced grace. "I'm starting a position at Boston Medical Center next month," he explained. "And I suppose I was looking for something familiar. I lived here during medical school." Laura nodded, and Michael noticed her studying his face with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. Was there something in his teeth? Or perhaps she was just deciding whether she found him attractive. "Have we—" she began, then stopped herself. "Sorry, you just look familiar somehow." Michael chuckled. "I get that a lot, actually. I must have one of those faces." The waiter approached, saving them from the awkward moment, and they ordered drinks, a glass of Cabernet for Laura and a bourbon for Michael. As the evening progressed, Michael found himself genuinely enjoying Laura's company. She was intelligent and articulate, with a dry sense of humor that matched his own. She told him about her work as a children's book editor, and he shared sanitized stories about his time with Doctors Without Borders, carefully avoiding mention of his memory loss. That wasn't first-date material. "So, you've really never tried cannoli from Mike's Pastry?" Laura asked incredulously as they finished their main course. "Not that I recall," Michael answered truthfully, though the name of the bakery did stir something in his mind, a faded image of crowded streets and the smell of sugar and coffee. Laura shook her head in mock disapproval. "That's practically sacrilegious in Boston. We'll have to remedy that." "Is that an offer for a second date?" Michael asked, surprised by his own boldness. Laura hesitated, then smiled. "Maybe. I'm still deciding." As they shared a dessert, a chocolate soufflé that melted in their mouths, the restaurant's sound system began playing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." Laura froze mid-bite, her expression suddenly distant. "Are you all right?" Michael asked. She blinked rapidly as if clearing away a memory. "Yes, sorry, this song. It just reminds me of someone." Michael nodded understandingly, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Laura wasn't telling him, something important. But who was he to judge? Everyone had their secrets, and his were bigger than most. By the time they stepped out into the cold December night, Michael was certain of two things. He wanted to see Laura again, and she was holding something back. "I had a nice time," she said, as they stood beneath the restaurant's awning, her breath visible in the chilly air. "So did I," Michael replied honestly. "Would it be too forward to ask for your number? I'd love to take you to Mike's Pastry and rectify my apparent Boston shortcoming." Laura seemed to wage an internal debate before nodding. "Okay, but just as friends for now. I'm not really looking for anything serious at the moment." "Friends it is," Michael agreed, though he felt a pang of disappointment as they exchanged numbers. As Laura walked away toward the tea station, Michael couldn't shake the sense that he'd just experienced something significant, though he couldn't articulate why. He touched the scar at his temple, a habit when he was troubled, and watched until she disappeared into the crowd. Laura Bennett. Something about her name, her voice, her laugh felt like an echo from his forgotten past. But that was impossible. If they'd met before, surely she would have said something, wouldn't she? Laura's hands trembled as she fumbled with her apartment keys. Once safely inside, she leaned against the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Winston padded over, meowing a greeting, but Laura barely noticed as she slid down to sit on the floor, her mind reeling. "It's not possible," she whispered to the empty apartment. "It can't be him." But it was. Despite the new beard and the slight limp, despite 5 years and thousands of miles, Laura would recognize Michael Hayes anywhere. Her ex-husband, the man she'd loved with her whole heart, the man she'd been told had died in Syria during a bombing 5 years ago. Laura fumbled for her phone, calling Melissa with shaking fingers. "How was it?" Melissa answered excitedly. "Where did you say he's been?" Laura asked, ignoring the question. Overseas with some medical organization." "Why? Was it terrible? He seemed so nice when James—" "Did James tell you anything else about him? About his past?" "Not much. Just that he was new at the hospital, had worked in conflict zones, and was divorced." "Laura, what's going on? You sound weird." Laura closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. "I need to go. I'll call you tomorrow." She ended the call before Melissa could protest, then immediately opened her laptop. With trembling fingers, she typed "Michael Hayes, Boston, Doctor, Syria, accident" into the search bar. The third result made her breath catch. "American doctor survives building collapse in Aleppo." The article was dated almost exactly 5 years ago, just weeks after she'd received the devastating news that Michael had been killed. According to the report, a doctor named Michael Hayes had been severely injured when a building was hit during an attack. He'd been working with Doctors Without Borders and had suffered traumatic injuries, including head trauma. There was no photo, but the details matched. The timing matched. Everything matched except for one crucial detail. The Michael Hayes she'd had dinner with tonight clearly had no idea who she was. Laura recalled their conversation, his careful answers, the way he'd said, "Not that I recall," when she'd asked about Mike's Pastry, a place they'd visited on their second date, where he'd gotten powdered sugar all over his blue Oxford shirt, and she'd laughed until her sides hurt. The Christmas song that had caught her attention, "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," had been playing during their first kiss, at a holiday party at Michael's medical school. Could it be possible? Had he lost his memory in that accident? Was that why he'd never reached out? Why he acted like they were meeting for the first time? Laura picked up Winston, cradling the large cat against her chest as she tried to process what this meant. Her ex-husband, the man she'd mourned, the man she'd never stopped loving despite their difficulties, was alive. And he had no idea who she was or who they had been to each other. Michael couldn't stop thinking about Laura Bennett in the days following their dinner. Something about her tugged at his consciousness, like a word on the tip of his tongue. He found himself wondering about her at odd moments while reviewing patient files at the hospital during his morning run along the Charles River as he unpacked boxes in his sparsely furnished apartment. He'd texted her the day after their date, suggesting coffee at a place near Boston Common, and she'd agreed, though her response had seemed hesitant. They were meeting this afternoon, and Michael felt an unexpected nervousness that went beyond typical second-date jitters. His phone rang, displaying his neurologist's name. "Dr. Hayes, I've reviewed your latest scans." "Doctor," Bartel said after they exchanged greetings. "There's been some increased activity in the temporal lobe regions associated with memory storage." Michael sat up straighter. "What does that mean exactly?" "It could be nothing significant, but it could also indicate some neural regeneration in the damaged areas. Have you experienced any new memory flashes or dreams recently?" Michael considered the question. "Some feelings of déjà vu, but nothing concrete. I've been back in Boston for 2 weeks now." "That might be contributing. Familiar environments can sometimes trigger dormant neural pathways. Keep track of any instances where you feel like you're remembering something, even if it's just a feeling rather than a specific memory." "I will," Michael promised, thinking of the strange familiarity he'd felt with Laura. After ending the call, Michael grabbed his coat and headed out. The coffee shop, Thinking Cup, was crowded but cozy, with holiday decorations adorning the walls and the scent of espresso and spices filling the air. Michael spotted Laura at a corner table, wearing a forest green sweater, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked up as he approached, and something in her expression, a vulnerability mixed with determination, caught him off guard. "Hi," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. "Thanks for meeting me." Laura nodded. "I got you a black coffee. I remembered you don't like sweet drinks." Michael blinked in surprise as he took the seat across from her. "How did you know that?" A flicker of panic crossed her face before she composed herself. "You mentioned it at dinner, didn't you, when you turned down dessert coffee?" "Did I?" Michael couldn't recall discussing coffee preferences, but his memory wasn't exactly reliable these days. "Well, thank you. Good memory." Laura's smile seemed forced as she wrapped her hands around her own mug, something with cinnamon sprinkled on top, he noted. "How's your week been?" he asked. "Busy. December is always chaotic in publishing." She paused, then added, "Michael, I need to ask you something, and it might seem strange." The serious tone caught him off guard. "Okay?" Laura took a deep breath. "What do you remember about your life before the accident in Syria?" Michael froze, coffee mug halfway to his lips. He'd never mentioned an accident to her. "How do you know about that?" Laura winced, as though realizing her mistake. I looked you up online after our date. There was an article about an American doctor who survived a building collapse in Aleppo. It was you, wasn't it?" Michael set his mug down carefully, studying her face. Something didn't add up. That's not the kind of detail most people would find in a casual internet search. Laura held his gaze, and he saw conflict in her eyes. "Please, just answer the question. What do you remember from before?" Michael felt exposed, vulnerable. He rarely discussed his memory loss with anyone, let alone someone he'd just met. And yet, something about Laura's intensity made him want to be honest. "Not much," he admitted quietly. "I know the basic facts of my life, where I grew up, where I went to school, my career. But personal memories, relationships, most of that is just gone. The doctors said the trauma caused retrograde amnesia. I've recovered some fragments over the years, but it's like trying to assemble a 1,000-piece puzzle with most of the pieces missing." Laura's eyes shimmered with what looked like unshed tears. "And your life in Boston before you went overseas? Do you remember any of that?" "Flashes. Places that feel familiar. Sometimes I'll take a turn on a street and know exactly what's around the corner before I see it." Michael leaned forward. "Laura, why are you asking me these questions?" She looked down at her coffee. "I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" When she looked up again, her expression had changed, more guarded, more controlled. "What it must be like to lose your past like that. It sounds incredibly difficult." Michael sensed she wasn't telling him everything, but he didn't press. Everyone was entitled to their secrets. "It is difficult, but I've adapted, built a new life." "Do you ever wonder about what you've lost? The people you might have known?" The question hit closer to home than she could know. "Every day," he admitted. "Especially now that I'm back in Boston. I know I lived here for years, had friends, maybe even." He trailed off, not wanting to mention his mysterious ex-wife, a woman he couldn't even picture in his mind. Laura nodded, seeming to come to some decision. "I should go. I have a manuscript deadline this afternoon." "Wait," Michael said, surprised by the abrupt shift. "Did I say something wrong?" "No, not at all." Laura gathered her things, avoiding his eyes. "I really do have to work. Thank you for the coffee." Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving Michael with the distinct impression that he'd missed something important, something right in front of him. Laura practically ran from the coffee shop, tears threatening to spill over. She made it 3 blocks before ducking into a small park, finding an empty bench where she could compose herself. He really didn't remember her. Not their first meeting in the hospital cafeteria where she'd been visiting her father and he'd been a second-year resident. Not their whirlwind courtship that had culminated in a small wedding at her parents' house in Concord. Not their arguments about his dangerous deployments or her reluctance to start a family while his future was so uncertain. He didn't remember any of it. Laura pulled out her phone and called the one person who might understand. "Dr. Everett's office," a cheerful voice answered. "This is Laura Bennett. I need to speak with Richard as soon as possible. It's urgent." 10 minutes later, her phone rang with a familiar number. "Laura, what's wrong?" Richard Everett had been Michael's mentor during residency and had become a friend to both of them. After Michael's supposed death, he'd helped Laura through her grief. "He's alive, Richard," Laura said without preamble. "Michael is alive." A long silence followed. "Laura, we've discussed this. I know grief can—" "No, you don't understand. I had dinner with him last night. He's back in Boston, starting at BMC next month. But he doesn't remember me. He doesn't remember anything about his life here." Another pause, then, "Where are you? I think we should talk in person." 30 minutes later, Laura sat across from Richard in his office at Massachusetts General Hospital. At 65, he was still imposing, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Tell me everything," he said once they were settled with cups of tea. Laura recounted her blind date, the subsequent research, and their coffee meeting that morning. The accident must have caused memory loss. But how could the hospital in Syria not realize he was married? How could they tell me he was dead if he wasn't? Richard sighed heavily. The situation in Aleppo was chaotic at that time. Communications were disrupted. Record-keeping was difficult at best. If Michael was unconscious and his wedding ring was lost. He shook his head. And if he couldn't tell them who to contact? "But someone should have verified before telling me he was dead." Laura's voice cracked. "I agree. It was a terrible mistake." Richard leaned forward. "Laura, what are you going to do now? Are you going to tell him?" The question she'd been wrestling with since recognizing Michael across the restaurant table. "I don't know. The doctors must have told him he was divorced." That would be in his records, but without memories to accompany that information. "He'd have no emotional connection to it," Laura finished. "To me." Richard nodded grimly. "Memory is complicated, Laura, particularly traumatic brain injuries. Some memories might return spontaneously with the right trigger. Others might never come back. So I could tell him everything, and he still might never remember our life together? The thought was devastating. It's possible. But it's also possible that hearing about your shared past might help trigger genuine recall. Richard paused. What does your heart tell you to do? Laura stared out the window at the Boston skyline, the familiar architecture now feeling as foreign as her life had become. Part of me wants to tell him everything immediately, but another part is afraid, Richard supplied gently. Yes, Laura admitted. Afraid he won't believe me, afraid he won't feel anything, afraid that even if I tell him every detail of our life together, he'll still be looking at me like I'm a stranger. She brushed away a tear. We were having problems before his last deployment, Richard. You know that. What if this is the universe giving us both a second chance at a clean slate? Richard's expression turned stern. That's not fair to Michael. He deserves to know the truth about his own life. I know, Laura whispered. I just need time to figure out how to tell him. As she left Richard's office, Laura felt the weight of an impossible choice on her shoulders. Tell Michael the truth and risk his rejection, or keep their past hidden and betray the trust they'd once shared. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Michael stood in front of his bathroom mirror, studying his reflection as if it might reveal secrets about the man he used to be. The scar at his temple, a pale line disappearing into his hairline, was barely visible now. But the damage it represented had changed everything. His phone chimed with a message from his colleague James. How'd it go with Laura? Second date's a good sign. Michael typed a response. Complicated. She had to leave suddenly. James replied almost immediately, That's odd. Melissa says she's usually very reliable. Michael hesitated, then typed, Do you know how she and Melissa became friends? College roommates at BU. Why? A BU, where Michael had attended medical school. The coincidence felt significant, though he couldn't articulate why. Just curious. Thanks. Michael set down his phone and opened his laptop. He hadn't done much research on his own past since the early days after the accident, when the frustration of missing memories had been too painful to confront directly. His therapist had encouraged him to focus on building new memories rather than obsessing over what was lost. But now, something drove him to search. He typed his own name into the search engine, along with Boston University Medical and 2010-2015, the years he would have been in medical school and residency, according to his records. Most results were academic papers or hospital newsletters. Nothing personal, no social media accounts. Those had apparently been deleted during his years overseas. On a whim, he added wedding to his search terms, hoping to find some record of his marriage. The fifth result caught his attention. A small announcement in the BU alumni magazine about graduates who had recently married. Dr. Michael Hayes, Medical 15, married Laura Bennett, English 14, in a private ceremony in Concord, MA. Michael stared at the screen in disbelief, reading the line over and over. Laura Bennett. His blind date, Laura Bennett. The same Laura who had been asking probing questions about his memory loss. The same Laura who had known how he took his coffee. The pieces suddenly fit together with devastating clarity. Laura wasn't just some woman he'd been set up with. She was his ex-wife, the woman he'd loved and lost and forgotten, and she hadn't told him. Michael closed his laptop, his mind racing. Why had she kept this from him? Why agree to the date at all if she knew who he was? And most importantly, what had happened between them that led to their divorce? He reached for his phone, then hesitated. What would he even say? Hi, I just found out you're my ex-wife. Care to fill me in on our failed marriage? Instead, he grabbed his keys. He needed air, needed to think. Boston's streets were decorated for Christmas, wreaths adorning doors and lights twinkling in windows. Michael walked without direction, letting his feet carry him while his mind grappled with this new reality. Eventually, he found himself in the public garden, where bare trees stretched toward the night sky, and the pond reflected the surrounding lights. He sat on a bench, the cold seeping through his coat, but he barely noticed. Had they walked these same paths together? Had they sat on this very bench? The thought that he might be unconsciously retracing steps from his forgotten life was both comforting and disturbing. As he sat contemplating, snow began to fall, light flakes drifting lazily from the sky. The sight triggered something in his mind, a flash, quick but vivid. Snow falling on dark hair, a red scarf, laughter, a woman's voice saying, "Make a wish, Michael." Was it Laura? Was it a real memory, or just his imagination constructing a scene based on what he now knew? Michael rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar headache that often accompanied these memory flashes. One thing was certain, he couldn't ignore what he'd discovered. Tomorrow he would confront Laura Bennett about their shared past. And this time, he wouldn't leave until he had answers. Laura woke to the insistent buzzing of her phone. Bleary-eyed, she fumbled for it on her nightstand. "Hello?" she mumbled, not fully awake. "We need to talk." Michael's voice tense and controlled. Laura sat up, instantly alert. "Michael, it's 7 in the morning. I know who you are, Laura. Or rather, who you were to me." Her heart sank. So he knew. "How did you find out?" "I did what you did, research, found our wedding announcement. What I don't understand is why you didn't tell me." His voice hardened. "Did you think it was funny, watching me fumble through dinner with no idea who you really were?" "No, of course not." Laura pressed a hand to her forehead. "It's complicated, Michael." "Then uncomplicate it. Meet me. Today." Laura closed her eyes, knowing this moment had been inevitable since she'd recognized him across the restaurant table. "Where?" "Boston Common, by the bandstand. Noon." "I'll be there," she promised. After hanging up, Laura sat motionless, Winston curled against her side. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than she'd expected. What would she say? How could she possibly explain? By noon, snow was falling steadily as Laura made her way to the bandstand. Michael was already there, a solitary figure against the white landscape. He wore a charcoal coat, hands thrust deep in his pockets, shoulders tense. "Hi," she said softly as she approached. Michael turned, his expression unreadable. "Tell me everything." Laura gestured to a nearby bench, brushing off the accumulated snow before they sat. "I don't even know where to start." "The beginning would be nice," Michael said, his voice tight. "When did we meet?" Laura took a deep breath. "Massachusetts General Hospital, 2013. I was visiting my father after his heart surgery. You were a second-year resident doing rounds. You spilled coffee on my book in the cafeteria." Michael's brow furrowed as if trying to conjure the memory. "What book?" "The Great Gatsby. You insisted on buying me a new copy, but the hospital gift shop didn't have it. So you got my number and promised to deliver a replacement." Laura smiled faintly at the memory. "You showed up at my apartment 2 days later with 3 different editions because you weren't sure which one I'd prefer." Michael stared at her, searching for some flicker of recognition. "And then? We dated for a year. You proposed at the top of the Prudential Tower. We got married in my parents' backyard in Concord in 2015, right after you finished your residency. It was small, just family and close friends." "Richard Everett," Michael said suddenly. "Was he there?" Laura's heart leaped. "Yes. He was your mentor. He gave a toast." She hesitated. "Do you remember him?" Michael shook his head. "Just a name that keeps surfacing. Someone important." He looked away, watching the snow fall. "When did it end?" "Us." Laura swallowed hard. It didn't. Not officially. His head snapped back to her. What do you mean? We were having problems, she admitted. You joined Doctors Without Borders and were constantly deploying to dangerous regions. I wanted you to take a position in Boston, to build a life here. We argued before your last deployment to Syria, said things we both regretted. Laura blinked back tears, remembering their last conversation, a tense phone call where neither had been willing to compromise. Then, 3 months into your deployment, I got a call saying you'd been killed in a bombing. Your body couldn't be recovered due to ongoing fighting. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to shock. They told you I was dead? Laura nodded, a tear spilling over. I mourned you, Michael, for years, and then you just appeared across a dinner table like some ghost. Michael ran a hand over his face, visibly processing this information. And you recognized me immediately. Yes, despite the beard, despite the years. Yes. Why didn't you say something that night? Why pretend we were strangers? Laura wrapped her arms around herself, against both the cold and the intensity of his gaze. You looked at me with absolutely no recognition, Michael. None. What was I supposed to say? Surprise. I'm your not-quite ex-wife back from the dead. I was in shock. And after, when you'd had time to process, why agree to coffee if you were just going to keep lying? I wasn't thinking clearly, Laura admitted. Part of me wanted to know what had happened to you. Part of me was afraid that telling you everything would be too much for you to handle. And part of me... She trailed off. What? Michael pressed. Part of me was afraid that even if you knew the truth, you still wouldn't feel anything for me, Laura whispered. That the man I loved really was gone, even if you were still here. They sat in silence as snow continued to fall around them, dusting their coats and hair with white. I need time to process all this, Michael finally said, his voice subdued, to figure out what it means. Laura nodded, understanding but heartbroken nonetheless. Of course. Do you have photos of us from before? Yes, Laura said. And letters you wrote me from your earlier deployments. I kept everything. Michael stood. I'd like to see them, not today, but soon. Whenever you're ready, Laura promised. As they parted ways, Laura watched Michael walk away, snow falling between them like a curtain of time, separating what was from what might be. The days before Christmas passed in a blur of work, and waiting for Michael to contact her again. Laura threw herself into the winter's book release, staying late at the office to avoid her empty apartment and the memories that now haunted her. Melissa had been shocked when Laura finally explained the situation. You're telling me James accidentally set you up with your not-dead ex-husband who doesn't remember you? That's insane. Welcome to my life, Laura had replied ruefully. On December 23rd, Laura's phone chimed with a text from Michael. Can I see those photos now? They arranged to meet at her apartment that evening. Laura spent the afternoon in a frenzy of nervous cleaning, though her place was already immaculate. Winston watched her skeptically from his perch on the bookshelf. What am I doing, Winston? She asked the cat, who blinked at her slowly in response. At precisely 7 o'clock, her doorbell rang. Michael stood in the hallway, a bottle of wine in hand. I wasn't sure if I should bring something, he said awkwardly. This felt like a wine kind of evening. Laura accepted the bottle with a small smile. Thank you. Come in. Michael stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over her apartment. The built-in bookshelves filled with novels and children's books, the comfortable sofa with its colorful throw pillows, the Christmas tree in the corner adorned with literary-themed ornaments. Nice place, he commented. Thanks. I've been here about 3 years. She didn't add that she'd moved after believing he'd died, unable to stay in the apartment they'd shared. Winston approached cautiously, sniffing at Michael's shoes. That's Winston, Laura explained. He's usually standoffish with strangers. As if to contradict her, Winston rubbed against Michael's leg, purring loudly. "Guess I'm special," Michael said with a half-smile. The moment felt achingly domestic, painfully close to the life they might have had. Laura busied herself opening the wine while Michael continued to explore the apartment, pausing at her bookshelves, touching the spines of familiar classics. "You organized these by color," he observed. Laura glanced up in surprise. "Yes. How did you know I didn't always do that?" Michael frowned. "I'm not sure. It just popped into my head." He accepted the glass of wine she offered. "So, the photos." Laura nodded, retrieving a box from her bedroom closet. They sat side by side on the sofa as she opened it, revealing carefully preserved mementos of their life together. "This was our first official date," Laura said, showing him a photo of them ice skating on the frog pond, their cheeks flushed with cold and happiness. "You were terrible at it." Michael studied the image of his younger self, arm wrapped around Laura's waist, both of them laughing. "I still am. At least some things don't change." Photo after photo told the story of their relationship. Hiking in the White Mountains, a weekend trip to New York City, their wedding day. Michael examined each one carefully, as if trying to absorb the memories captured within. "You kept your hair longer then," Laura observed, noting how the Michael in the photos wore his dark hair almost to his collar. "Easier to maintain in the field," he explained absently, focused on a photo of them outside Fenway Park. "I remember this place, the stadium, but not us being there together." Laura tried not to show her disappointment. "It was your birthday. Red Sox versus Yankees. They won in the 9th inning." Michael set the photo down and picked up a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon. "And these letters you wrote me from your first 2 deployments, before WhatsApp and reliable internet made communication easier." Laura hesitated. "You can take them home if you want. Read them in private." Michael nodded gratefully, slipping the letters into his coat pocket. "Did I write during my last deployment too? The one in Syria?" Laura's expression clouded. "A few emails, nothing substantial. We were not in a good place, because I wouldn't stay in Boston. That was part of it." Laura traced the rim of her wineglass. "I wanted to start a family. You wanted to continue your work overseas. Neither of us was willing to compromise." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry I don't remember any of it. You deserved better." "It wasn't your fault," Laura said softly. "Still." Michael looked around the apartment again, his gaze landing on the Christmas tree. "You always loved Christmas, didn't you?" Laura's breath caught. "Yes." "How did you know that?" Michael frowned. "I'm not sure. It just feels true." He stood, moving to the tree and touching one of the ornaments, a tiny replica of the Velveteen Rabbit. "Your favorite book as a child?" "Yes," Laura whispered, hope fluttering in her chest. "Michael, are you remembering things?" "Not exactly, just feelings, impressions." He turned to face her. "Dr. Patel, my neurologist, says that's common with my type of amnesia. Emotional memories sometimes survive even when episodic ones don't." Laura stood and moved closer to him. Close enough to catch the familiar scent of his cologne, the same one he'd always worn. "What are you feeling right now?" Michael met her gaze, his eyes troubled. "Confusion, frustration." He paused. "But also a sense that I'm supposed to be here, with you. Does that make any sense?" "Yes," Laura said simply. Without conscious thought, she reached out and took his hand. His fingers curled around hers automatically, as if their bodies remembered what their minds could not. In the background, her stereo switched to a new song. "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." The same song that had played during their first kiss. The same song that had caused her to freeze in the restaurant on their blind date. Michael's expression changed, his eyes widening slightly. This song. Laura held her breath, afraid to hope. What about it? We danced to this, he said slowly, at a Christmas party. You were wearing a red dress. There was mistletoe. Laura's heart raced. Yes, at your medical school graduation party. December 2014. You kissed me under the mistletoe and then pulled me onto the dance floor. Tears filled her eyes. You remember? Not everything, Michael cautioned. Just that moment, but it's something, isn't it? It's everything, Laura whispered. As the music continued to play softly around them, Michael tentatively raised his free hand to her face, his thumb gently brushing away a tear from her cheek. I think, he said carefully, that I'd like to try again. Not as the people we were before. I can't be him, not completely, but as the people we are now, if that's something you'd want. Laura smiled through her tears. I'd like that very much. In the glow of the Christmas tree lights, Michael Hayes kissed Laura Bennett, not as a memory, but as a new beginning. Epilogue, Christmas Eve 2023. Daddy, tell the story again. 4-year-old Emma bounced on her father's lap, her dark curls bobbing with excitement. Michael smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. Again, you've heard it 100 times. But it's my favorite, Emma protested, her brown eyes, so like her mother's, wide with anticipation. Mine too, Laura said, entering the living room with mugs of hot chocolate balanced on a tray. She set them down on the coffee table before joining her husband and daughter on the sofa. Well, Michael began, wrapping an arm around Laura while keeping Emma secure on his lap. Once upon a time, a doctor who'd forgotten his past went on a blind date with a beautiful book editor. That's you and Mommy, Emma interrupted gleefully. That's right, Michael confirmed, but the doctor didn't know that he'd once been married to this same book editor. Because of the accident that made him forget things, Emma supplied solemnly. Exactly. And the book editor was very surprised to see the doctor because she thought he had gone to heaven. But he didn't. Emma clapped her hands. No, he didn't. He was just lost for a while. And when they met again, they didn't recognize their love right away. It took time and patience and a special Christmas song to help the doctor remember. Have yourself a merry little Christmas, Emma sang, slightly off-key, but with great enthusiasm. Laura laughed, catching Michael's eye over their daughter's head. In the 6 years since their unexpected reunion, much had changed. Michael's memories had partially returned, enough for him to piece together most of their shared history, though some gaps remained. They'd remarried in a simple ceremony 2 years after reconnecting, bought a house in Cambridge, and welcomed Emma the following year. Michael still worked with Doctors Without Borders, but now in an administrative role that kept him in Boston. With occasional short trips for training or conferences, Laura had been promoted to senior editor and had even published her own children's book, inspired by their story. And now, Michael continued, the doctor and the book editor and their little girl live happily ever after. And Winston too, Emma added, pointing to where the aging Maine Coon lounged regally by the fireplace. Yes, and Winston too, Michael agreed. As Emma slid off his lap to retrieve her hot chocolate, Michael turned to Laura. Happy anniversary, he said softly. Laura smiled, knowing he meant the anniversary of their reunion, that fateful blind date that had brought them full circle. Who would have thought? I think part of me always knew, Michael admitted, even without the memories. Something in me recognized you. The heart remembers what the mind forgets, Laura said, quoting the inscription she'd had engraved inside his wedding band. Outside their window, snow began to fall, covering Boston in a fresh blanket of white. Nature's way of creating a clean slate, just as they had been given one. As the stereo played their song, Michael pulled Laura close, grateful for second chances and Christmas miracles that sometimes came disguised as blind dates.